Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel, AnatomyMentor. Exams are coming up, and I know there's a massive syllabus, especially when it comes to gross anatomy. So, today I'm going to discuss a particular region in the skull, which is very important whenever we talk about the head and neck or we talk about bone anatomy. And this region is known as the pterygopalatine fossa. So, we are going to be focusing today on the important aspects of this region, that is the location of the pterygopalatine fossa, its boundaries and its communications and its contents. So these are our learning objectives for today. And let's start with this topic. What is the location of pterygopalatine fossa? This is actually a small pyramidal space which is situated below the apex of the orbit, and it is lying between the pterygoid process of the sphenoid and the posterior aspect of the maxilla anteriorly. So that's the location of this here pterygopalatine fossa. Now, what are its boundaries? Well, the floor of this fossa is formed by the pyramidal process of the palatine bone, and the roof is formed by the body of sphenoid. The medial wall is formed by the perpendicular plate of palatine bone that is a part of the lateral wall of the nose. Its anterior wall is formed by the posterior wall of the maxilla, whereas posteriorly there is the sphenoid bone. So these are the boundaries of the pterygopalatine fossa, easy for quick revision, and if they are just in the form of a list, you can recall them at the time of your exam. Now, to develop a conceptual understanding of the location and the boundaries of pterygopalatine fossa, I've got over here a very simple diagram which is showing us the lateral view of the skull. And as you can see, the zygomatic arch and the mandible, they have been removed. And this larger area which is outlined is actually the infratemporal fossa. If we look a little deeper, we can see this here space. It's a small pyramidal or triangular space. This here is the pterygopalatine fossa. And this here pterygopalatine fossa, you can see that it is lying between this maxilla bone in light blue anteriorly and the sphenoid bone, which is in yellow color posteriorly. So the pterygopalatine fossa is lying between the maxilla and the sphenoid bones. Now, if we look at its margins, we're going to see that this here is the pterygomaxillary fissure, which is wider above and it becomes narrow down below, closing off this space below by another small piece of bone, which is over here, the pyramidal process of the palatine bone. Also, we can see in the medial aspect of pterygopalatine fossa, this here is the sphenopalatine foramen, and this leads into the nasal cavity. Now, what are the important communications of the pterygopalatine fossa? Keep in mind these are three in number. Number one is the communication with the infratemporal fossa through the pterygomaxillary fissure. Number two is its communication with the nasal cavity through the sphenopalatine foramen. And then number three, the communication with the orbit through the medial end of the or infraorbital fissure. So let's go back to that diagram and look at these three communications. Now this here is the one which I told you is the communication with the nasal cavity through the sphenopalatine foramen, which is present in the medial wall of pterygopalatine fossa. Then this here is the communication through the pterygomaxillary fissure with this larger space that is the infratemporal fossa. And then the third communication is through the inferior orbital fissure, or to be more specific, the medial end of inferior orbital fissure with this space, which is the orbit. So these are the three main communications of the pterygopalatine fossa. Also keep in mind that the foramen rotundum is an opening which is present in the posterior wall of this fossa, and it is the pathway of entrance of the important maxillary nerve. Now, this again is another picture. This is actually showing you the real picture of the bone, which is the skull, and it is showing you the inferolateral aspect of the skull. And this area, which is outlined by the green color, this is showing us the pterygopalatine fossa. And here you can see the pterygopalatine fossa. As I mentioned before, it is a small pyramidal space lying between this maxilla bone anteriorly and sphenoid bone posteriorly. And here we can see that is the sphenopalatine foramen in its medial wall, which is the communication with the nasal cavity. And here below is the pterygomaxillary fissure, which is its communication with the infratemporal fossa. This here region, the broader space, is the infratemporal fossa. And now we can also see this communication, which is through the inferior orbital fissure to the orbit. Let's look at the schematic diagram of the pterygopalatine fossa. Well, in this schematic diagram, this here is the pterygopalatine fossa, the area outlined in green. Then again, the communications, they have been shown. The sphenopalatine foramen. Through this, the communication is with the mucosa of nasal cavity, and this is on the medial aspect of pterygopalatine fossa. And then below this here is pterygomaxillary fissure, which leads to the infratemporal fossa. And then anteriorly, you can see the infraorbital fissure, which leads into the orbit. Other than that, in the posterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa, we have these three bony openings, or you could say passageways. So the one which is the highest is the foramen rotundum, through which it communicates with the middle cranial fossa. And remember, it transmits the important maxillary nerve into the pterygopalatine fossa. Also, below that, in the posterior wall, are the pharyngeal canal and also the pterygoid canal. Pharyngeal canal is its communication with the mucosa of pharyngeal vault, while the pterygoid canal is the communication of pterygopalatine fossa with the middle cranial fossa via the foramen lacerum. Okay, also keep in mind that inferiorly, the posterior superior alveolar foramina, they are leading via the pterygomaxillary fissure into the upper part of the maxilla. And below also you've got the greater and lesser palatine canals, through which the communication is established with the hard and soft palates. We are looking at the pterygopalatine fossa now from a different approach, which is the frontal approach through the region of the orbit. And here, if we look at this area, which is outlined by the green dotted line, this represents the pterygopalatine fossa. And over here, now we can see that in its posterior wall, the highest opening in the posterior wall is foramen rotundum. And then below that, we can see also the openings which are the pharyngeal canal. And we can also see the pterygoid canal, right? So pharyngeal canal and pterygoid canal. And in the medial aspect, here is the sphenopalatine foramen that I told you leads into the nasal cavity. And if we look over here inferiorly, we can see the passages that are there for the palatine canals, that is the greater and lesser palatine canals. And over here, this here is the inferior orbital fissure, and this area over here is the orbit. Now looking at the same orbital region, but now with the contents, with the structures which are present in pterygopalatine fossa. So here we can see the maxillary nerve, which remember is the second branch of the trigeminal nerve. This maxillary nerve is passing through the foramen rotundum to enter the pterygopalatine fossa. And also we can see over here the nerve of pterygoid canal, and we can see the pharyngeal nerve. These are passing through the pterygoid canal and pharyngeal canals respectively. And if you look over here, the maxillary nerve, as it enters the pterygopalatine fossa, gives off a branch which is the zygomatic nerve, which travels above the maxillary nerve in the infraorbital groove and canal, and then it divides into temporal and facial branches, and it gives off a communicating branch to the lacrimal nerve. The maxillary nerve itself will continue to travel in the infraorbital canal and groove, and eventually it will emerge on the frontal area, the frontal surface of the skull, just below the lower margin of the orbit on the surface as the infraorbital nerve through the infraorbital foramen to supply the skin of the face. Here is the palatine ganglion. This is an important structure lying within the pterygopalatine fossa. And remember, it is attached to the maxillary nerve through two branches. And also you can see over here the nasopalatine nerve, which is also a branch of the maxillary nerve, and it is passing through the spinopalatine foramen and entering into the nasal cavity. So these are the structures which are visible in this orbital approach. Now we're going to summarize the contents of the pterygopalatine fossa. First is the maxillary nerve. Also remember the maxillary vessels, they accompany the branches of the maxillary nerve. And of course the pterygopalatine ganglion with a small amount of fat. The maxillary nerve. After it arises from the trigeminal ganglion, the maxillary nerve leaves the skull through the foramen rotundum, which I just showed you is present in the greater wing of sphenoid bone that is in the posterior wall of pterygopalatine fossa to enter this region. And then it continues as the infraorbital nerve in the infraorbital groove and canal located in the floor of the orbit, eventually emerging from the infraorbital foramen to supply the skin of the face. Now, what are the branches of maxillary nerve? You have the superior alveolar nerve, which are anterior, middle, and posterior. So they're supplying the teeth. And then you've got the middle meningeal nerve, also the zygomatic nerve, and inferior palpable nerve, superior labial nerve, pharyngeal nerve, and the greater and lesser palatine nerves. Also, don't forget the nasopalatine nerve, which enters the nasal cavity through the spinopalatine foramen. So these are the summarized branches of the maxillary nerve. Then again, we've got the schematic diagram. And now we're going to look at the formation of an important nerve, which is known as the nerve of the pterygoid canal. This here is the nerve of the pterygoid canal. This is the nerve which is formed by the union of the greater petrosal nerve, which is itself a branch of the facial nerve. It contains the parasympathetic fibers. It contains the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. So here we can see that the nerve of the pterygoid canal, which is also known as the Vidian nerve, is formed by the union of the greater petrosal nerve, which carries the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers, and it's a branch of the facial nerve. And the other nerve which is contributing to the Vidian nerve is the depetrosal nerve. This is consisting of the sympathetic fibers, the sympathetic postganglionic fibers, which are derived from the plexus, sympathetic plexus present around you can see over here, the internal carotid artery. And these two nerves will then join to form the nerve of pterygoid canal, which will pass through the pterygoid canal in the posterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa to enter this pterygopalatine fossa. And just above it, you can see that is the foramen rotundum through which the maxillary nerve is going to enter from the middle cranial fossa. And you can see the maxillary nerve gives off the zygomatic nerve, which travels above the maxillary nerve in pterygopalatine fossa. And this then further divides into several branches, and eventually going to the region of the eye and also to the lacrimal nerve. Then we can see over here that the remaining continuation of maxillary nerve is the infraorbital nerve. Also, the maxillary nerve is attached to the pterygopalatine ganglion of the pterygopalatine fossa through these two branches, and over here through these connections, the different nerves are coming and going from the pterygopalatine ganglion to the maxillary nerve. Maxillary nerve also has these branches which are going to supply the nasal cavity and the region of the palate. And you can see over here are the greater and lesser palatine nerves, and you also got the superior alveolar nerves. This is a more detailed view of the nerves, which are the branches of maxillary nerve. Keep in mind that these branches, they have mixed fibers, which are sensory, sympathetic, and also they are secretomotor parasympathetic. We are going to look over here at this maxillary nerve, which you can see is the second branch of trigeminal ganglion, and here through the foramen rotundum, it enters the pterygopalatine fossa, which is the area outlined by green. It's a small narrow passage, it's a small narrow space present between the maxilla bone and the sphenoid bone. And here you can see clearly the two branches of communication of this maxillary nerve with the pterygopalatine ganglion lying within the fossa. And also you can see that this maxillary nerve here is giving off the important branches, which are, you can see the anterior superior alveolar branch, you can see the superior labial branch, also you can see the inferior palpable branch, right? And its continuation itself is the inferior infraorbital nerve, which travels in the groove and infraorbital groove and canal in the floor of the orbit. And here the maxillary nerve gives off the branch zygomatic nerve, supplying, you can see over here, a communicating branch to the lacrimal nerve, and also further dividing into two branches. And from the inferior aspect of this here ganglion, you can see are the greater lesser palatine nerves, which are going to pass through the pterygomaxillary fissure, and from there they're going to pass to the hard and soft palate. This here is the posterior-superior alveolar branch, and you can see it is distributed to the maxilla bone. Now let's talk a little about the pterygopalatine ganglion, which is the largest of the peripheral parasympathetic ganglia. It is deeply placed within the pterygopalatine fossa, just beneath the maxillary nerve and anterior to pterygoid canal and foramen rotundum. And it's a relay station, remember, between the lacrimatory nucleus of the pons and the glands. So the postganglionic parasympathetic fibers, they're going to be secretomotor to lacrimal gland, also to the nasal, pharyngeal, and palatine glands through the maxillary nerve. So this here table is showing us a summary of the nerves which are entering the pterygopalatine ganglion. We're talking about the parasympathetic fibers. So the origin is in the lacrimatory nucleus of pons. From there emerge the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers in the greater petrosal, and then they travel in nerve of pterygoid canal, also known as Vidian nerve. They will synapse in pterygopalatine ganglion. So here are the post-ganglionic nerve cell bodies, parasympathetic, which then travel as the postganglionic fibers within the maxillary nerve, and their target organs are the lacrimal glands and also glands of nasal cavity, palate, and nasopharynx. So they're secretomotor to these glands. As you might have heard about hay fever, you should have a runny nose. So that is because of the stimulation of these glands, stimulation of these nerves. Then again, a schematic diagram which is showing us a summary of these nerves and their connections. We can see here is the greater petrosal nerve carrying, as I told you, the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers, and this is a branch of facial nerve, and it is joining the deep petrosal nerve, which is carrying the sympathetic fibers from the sympathetic plexus around internal carotid artery, and they join to form this here nerve of pterygoid canal. And this nerve of pterygoid canal, then you can see it's going to synapse in pterygopalatine ganglion. Postganglionic parasympathetic fibers, you see, they are now going to be distributed through these several branches. They also contain sympathetic fibers. They also contain the sensory fibers. And you can see the different branches are nasopalatine nerve, the greater lesser palatine nerves. They're going to the hard and soft palate respectively. And you can also see the pharyngeal branch going to the nasopharynx. And here is the maxillary nerve, which is, you can see over here, connected to pterygopalatine ganglion through these two, you can see communications or two routes of communications through which nerves are coming and going. This maxillary nerve, it has this branch zygomatic nerve, which travels just above it within the pterygopalatine fossa, and it gives a communicating branch to the lacrimal nerve. So this is a crisp summary of all that we have been discussing, and I'm reinforcing it again and again so you can remember and not forget it. So the important thing to remember when we talk about the functional aspect, that the pterygopalatine ganglion, its relation to the sensory and postganglionic sympathetic fibers is topographic, which means that these fibers, they don't actually synapse in this ganglion. Their relation is that they're just located or lying within this ganglion, or they're just passing through it. But in case of the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers, their relation to the pterygopalatine ganglion is functional, because they're going to synapse over here, and then the postganglionic fibers are going to arise from the ganglion. Now let's talk about the maxillary artery, which is also present in pterygopalatine fossa. This is the third part of maxillary artery, remember, is the terminal branch of the external carotid artery that lies within the pterygopalatine fossa. Branches are given off in this fossa and then they enter the bony foramina. The third part of maxillary artery, it eventually leaves the pterygopalatine fossa through the spinopalatine foramen, where its name is changed to spinopalatine artery, and then it will become the main artery of the nasal cavity. Now, what are the branches of this third part of maxillary artery that are given off within the pterygopalatine fossa? Well, let's do a quick summary. These are posterior-superior alveolar artery, the greater palatine artery, the pharyngeal artery, the artery of the pterygoid canal, and the inferior orbital artery. So these are the branches of the third part of maxillary artery within the pterygopalatine fossa. And you can see each artery will travel through its specific foramen to its destination of supply. Now I'm going to be giving a short demonstration on a three-dimensional digital model of the region which is known as the pterygopalatine fossa, so you can get a holistic view of this space and the other spaces which are surrounding the pterygopalatine fossa. Okay, so here is a digital model. It's a three-dimensional representation of the human skull. And if you see this side over here is representing the bony aspect of the human skull on the right side. And if did regions which are representing the different spaces or the areas in the head. So we can see over here that number one is the neurocranium. So this is the area in purple. The neurocranium is the part of the skull that contains the brain. So let's come over here now to this area in yellow. This cone-shaped space, which is labeled 10, represents the orbit, which is the area which contains the eyeball. And if we look over here below area 10 in dark blue, this is labeled 8. This is the nasal cavity. And below the nasal cavity in orange is the oral cavity over here. So on the lateral aspect, the mandible, that is the lower jaw, has been removed, and the zygomatic arch has also been removed. And we're looking at these bony spaces over here. Number 5, the area in light blue, this is the infratemporal fossa. We talked about it before. Now let's just look over here, and place that we are focusing on is the pterygopalatine fossa. Now, pterygopalatine fossa, as I mentioned before, it's a narrow region, and this region is going to be present over here. If I just focus this model a little over here in this region, I can show you this area in red is the pterygopalatine fossa, right? So this area in red is the pterygopalatine fossa. You can see it's a small triangular or pyramid-shaped face which is present. And over here, the part labeled 6 is the pterygomaxillary fissure, which is the communication between the infratemporal fossa laterally and the pterygopalatine fossa medially. Okay, so over here, this is the pterygoid canal, which is the opening in the posterior wall of pterygopalatine fossa, and this transmits the nerve of the pterygoid canal, also known as the Phidian nerve. And here, number 7 is the spinopalatine foramen. This is the opening in the medial wall of pterygopalatine fossa, and this transmits the nerve, which is the nasopalatine nerve, and it's the communication of this fossa with the nasal cavity. So over here, when we look over here from the posterior aspect, we can also see that this is the foramen rotundum, which is the opening in the upper part of posterior aspect or wall of pterygopalatine fossa. It transmits the maxillary nerve. And so area number 3 itself, this red area over here, that is the pterygopalatine fossa. So this was the appearance over here in a three-dimensional model, which helps us understand the location of this important space, that is the pterygopalatine fossa. Now let's come back to our PowerPoint slides. We have covered the essentials of the pterygopalatine fossa. So now I'm going to discuss a few MCQs with you to reinforce some essential aspects. So MCQ number 1, the maxillary nerve passes through the following foramen to enter the pterygopalatine fossa. Now, since we had talked about this again and again, you would know by now that it is the foramen rotundum. That is the passageway of the maxillary nerve. So for this MCQ, C is the answer, that is foramen rotundum. Now, which of the following nerves transmits the postganglionic sympathetic fibers? Well, you can see the options over here. The chorda tympani branch of facial nerve carries gustatory fibers. The greater petrosal and lesser petrosal nerves, they both carry the parasympathetic fibers. So the correct answer to this MCQ is B, the deep petrosal nerve. This is the one which transmits the postganglionic sympathetic fibers from the sympathetic plexus around the internal carotid artery, as we read about it just a while ago. Now, the third MCQ is name the communication between the pterygopalatine fossa and infratemporal fossa. That's an easy one. This communication, I told you again and again, is the pterygomaxillary fissure. So D is the answer for this MCQ. Now, which of the following nerves is formed within the foramen lacerum of the skull base? Well, the answer for this one is the nerve of the pterygoid canal, also known as Vidian nerve. Remember, it is formed within the foramen lacerum by the union of the greater petrosal with the deep petrosal nerve. So D would be answer for this MCQ. So that concludes with today's discussion on the pterygopalatine fossa. Today we discussed this very important region in a summary. We talked about its boundaries, its contents, and its communications. So it's an important region. Don't forget to revise it for your exams. And I will be coming back later with more important topics from gross anatomy. And I also share my video lectures on embryology, neuroanatomy, and histology. So don't forget to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is AnatomyMentor. And I will be coming back with more videos. If you found this helpful, do not forget to hit the subscribe icon, hit the bell icon also for the notifications of my uploads. So thank you, take care, and have fun studying.